You're listening to the CEO's Wingwoman podcast. I'm Olivia Jenkins, your host and virtual coach, helping you scale your brand to cult-like status. Since 2019, I've helped over 100 clients generate in excess of 45 million in revenue. And now it's time for me to share my tips, tricks, and strategies to help you supercharge your growth. I'm here to help you step into your power to develop a bulletproof strategy and growth mindset to match. Consider me your secret weapon to scale. Let's get started. Welcome to the CEO's Wingwoman podcast, the ultimate growth mindset podcast for ambitious CEOs wanting to create cult brands. I'm your host, Olivia Jenkins, and today I am honored to be joined by the amazing Madelyn Carafa. She is a passionate health enthusiast, mum of 2 beautiful babies, and the host of the wildly successful Healthy Hustlers podcast. I'm very excited to have Madelyn on the show today. We have actually known each other for several years now, and we just immediately clicked when we first connected. I love her passion for all things mindset, manifestation, and positivity, which is exactly why I wanted to invite her on the show today. So please welcome Madelyn to the show.
Oh, Liv, thank you. I'm blushing. That was very nice being on the opposite end of the microphone and having a warm welcome. Thank you so much.
So excited to have you here. I obviously love and adore you. And I know that we just had the instant connection when we first met. We just clicked. So I'm really excited to have you here today and just let you share your story, because I feel like you're always, as you say, on the other side of this arrangement. And now it's a good opportunity for you to tell your story and for people to find more about you and your background and just, a little bit of an introduction, I guess, from a personal perspective and a business perspective. So to open up, can you introduce yourself? Just let listeners know who you are, what your background is personally, and a little bit about the business as well, being the podcast.
Amazing. Of course. Thank you. As Liv kindly said, I'm Madelyn. I am a mum of 2 little babes. I've got Georgia Florence, who is 4. She's at kinder. I think do you call it kinder? It's like basically 3-year-old kinder. So she's there at the moment, and I've got a 17-month-old, very active little boy, Rocco. So that is probably my main focus, to be honest, at the moment. But 5 years ago, I started the Healthy Hustlers podcast, which is a health and wellbeing podcast show where I interview and collaborate with highly influential people who are at the top of their game. And really the idea or the concept of the podcast is to find out their healthy habits and their mindset practices that help them thrive in life. And so that came about really when I was climbing what I guess I always refer to it as the never-ending corporate ladder. So I was in a full-time marketing and event management job for a large global fashion retailer, which I absolutely loved, but I was young and very, I guess, eager to keep climbing that ladder. But what was coming with it was a lot of burnout at a really young age. And I always knew that I wanted to be a mum, and the struggle I was having at that time was wondering how I was ever going to balance a career that I loved with motherhood. And it never made sense how that would work. And I used to look at mums in this corporate world and I used to think, oh my goodness, how are you doing this all of the time when I'm, 25 and struggling burnout constantly now, and I don't even have any children to look after. I can go home and get a full night's sleep. So I started to become really curious about successful people. I was able to, at that time, actually work with a lot of, I guess, really influential people who were ambassadors for the brand. So I was working with people like the likes of Sally Fitzgibbons, a female surfer, Joel Selwood, who's a big AFL, if you're in Victoria, you would know. And I was working with these people, Tegan Martin's another one, and I was just always so intrigued, how are they always on? They were always so happy and vibrant, but, they were traveling and had so many demands. And so I got really curious about it, and really it just came down to their healthy habits and the fact that they had really good boundaries. They were always working on their mindset. They were always prioritizing their health no matter what. And so I started to inject a lot of those things like meditation, really healthy eating, having stricter boundaries with bedtime and not being social during the week. And it was life-changing, it really was. And all of a sudden I was like, oh my goodness, I need to share this with people. Like, how do I tell more people about this? And so that's where it really, I guess, the idea sparked from. And I ended up leaving the corporate job where I was like, quite burnt out, and got a job back in Melbourne. And closer to home, I started walking to work or riding my bike, and had just a lot more balance, I guess, at that age. And yeah, that's where the idea for the podcast kind of came about. So that was 5 years ago now. And yeah, I'm still here today creating the podcast, which is pretty cool after 2 kids.
Well done, you. I'm so curious as well, because I feel like you were on the earlier curve of podcasting. There's obviously a lot more podcasts around these days than what there would have been back then. What was it about podcasting that you thought, yes, that's the thing that I'm going to do? Not, something through Instagram or blogging or another, channel. What was it specifically about podcasting that you were drawn to?
It's interesting you say that, because it definitely was, like, I like to say it was the OG, like, Australian health podcast, because at the time there was literally only, like, Melissa and Prasini was already quite big in Australia. But outside of that, it was really American podcasts were on the channels. And so I really got into podcasting when I was kind of starting to inject those healthy habits. And a few people had mentioned like they listened to podcasts. And at the time, because I was being so, I guess, mindful of what was serving me versus what wasn't, I became really aware of what I was consuming in the morning, how much that would actually impact my energy in the day. And so prior to that, I would put on like one of those morning shows and have that going in the house while I'm getting ready for work. And I realized I'm carrying so much of this negative energy first thing in the morning, like I'm leaving the house at 7:30 in the morning, and like whatever's been on the news has already kind of dictated the way that I'm feeling for the day. And so I started to listen to podcasts in the morning as I was getting ready. And I was learning so much so quickly from these podcasts, and the energy, like the energetic shift that I had and the way that I was being able to show up in the day, I was so inspired and ready for work. And so that's where I kind of, I guess, really learned about podcasting or it being a thing. And I think listening to the American ones, they're already quite established. So they had things like advertisements and sponsors in it. So you can kind of understand how I had a marketing background as well. So I could understand very easily how they had monetized this platform. Mm-hmm. And so then it wasn't until I got the job back in Melbourne and I just created a lot more space in my life, and I started, walking or riding to work without like music in. I had a lot more just time with my thoughts and in my mind. And I think when you allow that space and that stillness, it allows opportunities for the universe to actually communicate with you and for you to listen to your own intuition. So I think deep down, I always knew there was something for me. I always knew that like I was here for something, but I just wasn't quite sure. I actually have this notebook which has about 1,500 different business ideas in it. I've always had and I used to just like jot things down and figure out how I'd make money, and none of them obviously ever happened. But I always was kind of wired that way. I grew up with 2 parents who were, business owners and stuff. So I think I had that kind of intrinsically built into me in a way, just from seeing my parents grow up. So the idea of the podcast just came about when I was walking to work, and I still remember the exact moment, because the day before I'd been thinking about like what my strengths were and what things I loved from my old corporate job versus what I was doing now. And one of the things that just kept coming up for me was that when I was with Cotton On, I used to do a lot of interviewing for like the Cotton On Body blog. And so we'd get like entrepreneurs or people successful in the health space into the workplace. And I would like interview them on the lounge, or would do like lives on Instagram. And I always just felt so lit up by that. And it was so outside of my comfort zone. And I love that feeling of being outside your comfort zone, because I think that that's where the magic really lies. And so I kind of had brought awareness to this fact of like how much I loved that element of my old job, and I wasn't doing it in my current job. And so then the next day I'm walking home from work, and yeah, I remember I was walking through the botanical gardens, and I literally just had I can only explain it as a download. It was like it literally just dropped into my head from the universe. You need to start a podcast. And the name of the Healthy Hustlers literally was just on my tongue. I was like, I'm going to call it the Healthy Hustlers. And I called a girlfriend and I was like, oh my God, I've got this idea. Like, what do you think? And she's like, I love it. I'm like, do you want to do it with me? So I actually started it with one of my best friends. She was with me for the first 6 months. And then she's super entrepreneurial. She's gone on to create many successful businesses since that. But yeah, it was just all there for me. I just was like, I understood exactly what it was meant to be about, what I wanted to talk about, who I wanted to interview. And it really just spiraled from there. But in saying that, I had no idea that it would end up. It was literally just to fuel a passion that I had for interviewing and getting to know people on a deeper level, really.
I love that so much, because as you were chatting through that and you were talking about that download, as you called it, it reminded me a lot of speaking with visionary CEOs, particularly product-based business owners. And every single one of them has had what I call an entrepreneurial seizure. That moment where this thing just happens and this idea comes to you. So it was really interesting to hear you talk through that, because I haven't necessarily heard it from the perspective of something like starting a podcast or whatever it may be. But for you, yes, that was your entrepreneurial seizure where you were like, this is it. This is the thing that I want to be doing. And it just came to you, which I think is so perfect.
Yeah, it really did. And I still remember going home and like telling Ryan, my husband, and, you know, by that stage, he'd heard of like 30 other business ideas that I was going to do. And I remember he was just cooking dinner and he's like, oh yeah, cool. Like, babe, that sounds great. Like, cool. And but in my body, it felt so different. I was like, I'm actually going to do this. Like, this just feels so right. Like nothing had ever like hit me in that way or felt that way. And so, yeah, it was a really cool moment. Like I actually relive it a lot sometimes in meditation and stuff, because I think that when you do allow that space, that clarity is kind of there. If you allow it, we just happen to live in such busy lifestyles now and we are always on the go, you know. And I think that's where the hustlers came from, is like not letting your hustle be a compromise for your healthy lifestyle, because that was my problem, was I was letting the hustle be compromised for all of the healthy habits and, you know, the amazing things that allow you to keep hustling at a high level.
I feel like that was your full body yes moment as well, you know, in life where, you know, certain opportunities come to you and, you know, at times, particularly in that hustle culture, you might find yourself saying yes to a lot of things that aren't necessarily in 100% alignment, or that you might not necessarily 100% want to do. But I think that there's a lot of power in that as well, of if you feel it in your body, if you feel it in your energy, and it's like there is a full body yes moment, then that is something that you need to go after with 100% energy, instead of saying yes to lots of different opportunities that aren't fully aligned. And then you've just split up your energy across multiple projects and really diluted everything to the point where you are feeling burnt out or stressed or maybe not completely fulfilled. So I think there's a lot of power in that too.
Yeah, for sure. I 100% agree with that.
So what happened next? You had this full body yes moment. The name came to you. You obviously checked in with your husband and your girlfriend. Like, did you just madly go and create branding and you were like, I just need to get a logo together and a podcast graphic? What did you do next? I'd love to know.
Yeah, basically that's exactly what I did. For me, I'm like a visual person, so I really needed to get it out of my head and onto paper so that it made sense to everyone else, because in my head it was like, it was so crystal clear what I needed to do. And so that night I literally sat on my computer and made, like, it was PowerPoint back then. I made a PowerPoint document to send to my friend. And, you know, it had all of the things of like what the main philosophy of the podcast was, what the vision would be, the mission behind it, ways that we could monetize it, make money, potential brands that we could work with, guests that we would love to interview, and then like the values of the podcast. So it was basically just like, I guess, a bit of a business template or marketing plan, really. And it just all flowed onto paper. And I just remember it. And then I created a logo. I don't even know what I did it on back then. I'm not sure. It might have been Canva. I can't really remember. I don't know if Canva was a thing. It was terrible anyway, the logo. But I remember in that moment being like, I'm going to look back and laugh at this one day, but it's also going to show me how far I've come. So the philosophy of like done is better than perfect was a huge, huge factor for me at that stage, because I just knew the longer that I sat on this, the more the fear would come in and the more the self-doubt and the more people I spoke to, the less likely I would have been to actually like do it. Because like back then podcasting, I still remember being at a party and maybe it was about 18 months after I had launched the podcast and like it was doing really well, but I still would never have told anyone, like a stranger, if they asked me what I did, I'm like, oh, I'm just in health and wellbeing, or I've got a health and wellbeing business. And I remember this girl from school turning to me at this party and she's like, oh, how's your radio thing going? And Ryan just looked at me and laughed. And I was like, oh yeah, it's going pretty well. And we got in the car and he's like, your face when she asked you. And I'm like, it's not a radio, it's a podcast. But like back then it was just like, it was so not what people had ever heard kind of thing. You know, I still have girlfriends today being like, how do you actually make money? Like, how do you make money through a podcast? So yeah, it was very foreign to people back then.
I think as well, we sort of have to get used to new trends. And I think podcasts were no different back then. Initially, it was a bit foreign. Sort of, you had the early adopters of people that started listening to podcasts. And then all of a sudden, it was like this massive explosion. Then everyone was listening to podcasts. And then in came all of the different podcasts that were entering the market as well. So it's definitely one of those things that has been learnt over several years.
Yes.
But you're so right. I feel like back then it would have been a little bit left of field, basically.
Yeah, totally. I reckon it's probably only been in the last maybe year or two that I've felt really confident when people ask me what my job is, that I say I have a podcast show. Like, because it absolutely was not a thing. And it almost opened up way too many questions prior to that I was like, oh, I just like can't be bothered explaining this to every single person.
I also feel like you're very modest with yourself as well. Like just a casual 3 million downloads plus everyone for playing at home.
Oh, thanks.
So on the strategy side of things, I know you said, okay, marketing plan or, business plan to get the bones of the show together and the vision and the mission and who you were going to interview. What was your strategy in getting people on the show? Because obviously initially, everyone starts at zero, whether it's a podcast, a business, an Instagram, whatever it may be. We all start from ground zero. What was your strategy in terms of getting the podcast off the ground and getting the first, high profile guest, who was that, by the way? Who was the first guest that you had on that was high profile? Do you remember?
So I guess that was a little bit of my, if I can call it that, a superpower, is that one of my biggest strengths has always been my networks and I guess my relationships with people. And I've grown up in a family who really have a strong ability to do that as well. Like my uncles and, my dad, they're all very connected in their networks. And it's, I guess, through being a people person, but I've always seen them utilize their networks as such a strength to build businesses and ongoing relationships and opportunities. So that's been quite a natural, I guess, skill to me. And so I did have the privilege when I was at my first corporate job of working with quite a lot of higher profile people. So I had quite well-established relationships. So they were kind of the first people that I was like, if anyone's going to support me, it's going to be this group of people basically. So one of the first steps that my girlfriend and I took, she was like, before we buy any equipment or tell anyone we're doing this, let's just make a deck that explains, the questions and what the podcast is about and email it to as many people as we have a contact for. And as soon as someone says yes, it means that we have to go and buy the equipment and get everything set up. So I was like, okay, that's a cool approach. I like that. So we made a list of the people that we already had contact with through work. And who was the first? So Sarah, she was Sarah Holloway, Sarah Davidson now. She is Spoonful of Sarah on Instagram. I had a really good relationship with her through Cotton On Body. So she was one of the first people. And Sarah is just if you listen to her podcast, CZA, or follow her on Instagram, she's just the highest vibing, loveliest, most supportive person ever. So she was just a hell yes. She's like, oh my God, I love this for you. This is amazing. Yes, I'm in. And I'd interviewed her a lot through Cotton On Body. So that was quite a comfortable friendship. And then we also had Ariel Kaplan. She was another person I'd worked with. She's an actress. And Sally Fitzgibbons was on our list too. And my girlfriend Tegan Martin, who's been a big part of the show since. They were all girls we'd worked with through Cotton On Body. So they were kind of our initial ones. As soon as they said yes, we're like, oh, okay, cool, let's do this. And then once we had that base, once someone said yes, we then made the list of the people we didn't know, but we were really inspired by and would love to have on the podcast. We basically just reached out to them and was like, hey, we've got like X, Y, and Z coming on our podcast. We'd love to have you to like add you to the list. So it kind of just flowed on from there, really. And that was kind of one of the things that we kept leveraging, was just telling the guests that we were approaching who had already featured on the show. But it was just, a lot of it came down to timing too. I think it was at a time where people that were in the public eye, you know, either influencers or celebrities, had been in a situation for so many years where the media had controlled the voice or the story and the language. Even if they were interviewed, the media would chop that up and package it however they decided to, with whatever headline they decided to use. And so this was kind of the first opportunity. Like, I think I would say that 95% of the guests that I've had never done a podcast prior to coming on to the Healthy Hustlers. So it was the first kind of real opportunity that they got to sit in a long format interview where they controlled the whole narrative and the whole storyline, and nothing was edited. It was all, you know, what they wanted to speak about. And so it was kind of quite exciting for them really as well. So yeah, once we had the first few interviews done, we then reached out to girls like Steph Claire Smith and Laura Henshaw and a few of those bigger influencers, and everyone was just so, that was the biggest thing I learned. Like, people are just so generous with their time, I think. And when you're in that space of like, you know, entrepreneurial women who have done that hustle and, you know, working towards what they want, they're so happy to kind of support other people that are doing the same. I know there's this like Instagram quote going around lately that says like, a successful bodybuilder or something would never say anything about you starting to lift weights, or a podcaster would never say anything about you starting a podcast from scratch. It's always the people who are not doing the thing that are going to be the ones passing the judgment. And that really like resonated with me when I read that, because I thought that's exactly what I've felt through this doing this podcast, is the biggest cheerleaders are the women who have, and men who have had the biggest success already and are so like just so happy to cheer on someone else that's like getting in the arena and having a crack as well.
For sure. And I feel like that fear of what other people think is definitely something that stops people from pursuing their passion or their dream or starting the business. But at the end of the day, I know for me and myself in consulting and coaching and doing all the things that I do, for me, it's like if you just help one person with the content that you share or the content that you create, that's amazing to be able to have that impact on somebody else's life. And clearly for you, over 3 million downloads, you've had that times 3 million, which is absolutely incredible. And I take my hat off to you, because if you had let that fear back then stop you from doing what you wanted to do with the show, you potentially wouldn't have had the impact of changing the lives of potentially millions of people with what you've been able to achieve with the podcast, which I think is amazing.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, it's funny. I think I was definitely a lot more naive back then. And I think having that marketing kind of background, and I have a lot more fear now, which is so funny. I think after 2 kids and, you know, navigating business and being more in the online space, I have such a bigger fear of judgment than I ever did back then when I started. I was just so young and eager and like, you know, in the hustle anyway, that I was like, I don't want to be doing this daily grind for someone and building someone else's dreams. So I'm just going to have a crack at doing mine. And my husband's really entrepreneurial as well. Like, he started his own business, electrical business at 23. So, you know, I was kind of surrounded by his energy as well, where he was building his own kind of empire. And I was like, oh, I really want a piece of that, and was always really inspired by that. So I think if you're surrounded by, you know, the right people and you're having those kind of expansive conversations, you know, it's like that saying that you're the result of the 5 closest people to you. In that time, I really did make sure I was surrounding myself with people who were expansive, and I continue to do so. You know, I really am mindful of who I talk about with my big visions and my dreams, because I need those people to be on the same level and be super expansive, because yeah, they're the ones of like showing you new ways of doing things, and the last ones to kind of pass judgment.
For sure. I'd love to touch on what you feel were the 3 biggest things that helped you grow the podcast.
Oh, that's a big question. Okay. I definitely would say that timing was absolutely a key factor. And not that I want that to put anyone off starting podcasts, because I think you can have a very successful podcast at any time. But for when the Healthy Hustlers launched, it was definitely, as I said, I like to say it's one of the OG podcasts in Australia. So there kind of wasn't anything like it. And there wasn't, the guests hadn't been interviewed in that sort of format before. So I think it was like Instagram had been such a big thing for so long, and people were already so intrigued and so obsessed with, you know, these influential people, but they're only getting such a snippet of their life. And so I think to actually be able to get into their mind and to really understand like their healthy habits and their mindset and like the coaches that they worked with or the courses that they'd done, like to really be able to get that, you know, all wrapped up in a 30-40 minute interview and be able to walk away with like incredible value. I think that was definitely one of the biggest things that was like why it was able to be so successful. And also those guests sharing the show, you know, it was back then they were so happy to always be sharing it because they had delivered this story or this in the way that they wanted to. So I think that was a big part of it.
For sure. I almost feel like as a consumer, as in a social media consumer, back then we were craving more from the people that we were following, like more of them, more authenticity, more about who they truly were, the D&M, what we were talking about offline.
Yes, exactly. And it's so funny that you say that, Liv, because a lot of the messages back then that I would get was like, oh, I've followed this person or so-and-so for so long. And like, I really like them, but like, you know, after listening to them on your podcast, like I'm obsessed with them, or I love that they, you know, spoke about this so openly or so vulnerably. And it really allowed them to like totally tap into these people in such an authentic way. And the guests have always been so, I guess, just so incredible with what they have been willing to share and the vulnerabilities and the rawness that they've been able to go into. And I think that that's, you know, at the end of the day, a podcast is a value exchange. Like you're giving someone content, but they're also giving you their time. Like, you know, I know how hard it is to listen to a podcast, and I've been listening to them for 5 years, and like sometimes I'll literally get to listen to one a fortnight, but it's like I know what that exchange is like. And when I listen to a podcast, I want it to be high value. I want to walk away and be like, oh, I really got something from that. And so I think that I hope that that's what the show's been able to give to people over the journey.
For sure. I feel like it's also giving Beckham. Have you watched that Netflix documentary yet, Beckham?
Oh, Ryan's watched it, my husband, but I have watched snippets of it. So yeah, I feel like I need to go back and watch it now.
You have to watch it. I think even it's made me have the perspective that you do, what you were saying before about how having people on the show gave them an opportunity to, you know, have their own narrative and say things the way that they wanted to say them and position themselves the way that they wanted to be positioned. And I feel like there's a lot that came through with the Beckham documentary because and I know a lot of people say the same because I've seen a lot of this online, but it's almost like you've seen a totally different side to the two of them as a couple that you never saw before because of the way that they were portrayed in the media. So I think that's really interesting as well.
It's so interesting. And it's like, you know, we kind of underestimate that we're really only seeing such a small portion. Like not everyone freely shares every moment of their life on Instagram. You know, there is some people that do it and do it so well, but the majority like share, it's a highlight. Like it really is snippets and tiny moments in a day or a week. And we create a whole storyline around that. And then the media create their own storyline around that. And that's then what we become to believe, whether seeing it and hearing it fresh from someone's perspective that's actually gone through that is just, yeah, it's so powerful, I think. And just tapping into people's, feelings and emotions, which I think is what people have been able to do during the Beckham series, is really understand from his own side and Posh's side, like what something actually felt like and how that had a flow-on effect on their family and their mindsets and their relationships and all of that. You know, we do never know what actually goes on behind closed doors.
For sure, definitely.
Attention visionary CEOs. Ready to elevate your business IQ? Introducing the Business Academy by Olivia Jenkins, setting the gold standard in business education. Launching this November, this pilot 12-week program is perfect for startups, scaling businesses, and seasoned CEOs aiming for long-term growth. Get ready for bi-weekly live group coaching calls led by yours truly and bi-weekly masterclass drops on CEO mindset, leadership, strategy, marketing, sales psychology, and branding. But here's the catch. The pilot intake this November has limited spots available, so visit www.oliviajenkins.co/academy to secure your spot now.
I know you were saying before as well that one of your superpowers is connecting with people and obviously having these really powerful conversations. Would you say that's another reason why the podcast has been able to be so successful when you think about those three things that have been game changers?
Yeah, I guess so. I feel like, I hope that I create a space where people feel safe to share. And I hope that I create a space where, they feel empowered to, I guess, to shine a little bit as well, to really be able to put it all on the table and be proud of it. And I think when that's delivered in a really authentic way, people love that. They want to go and inject those healthy habits. They want to go and try all the rituals that people talk about or buy the person's products. Or I hope that's been part of the success, definitely.
Amazing. And what about consistency as well? Because I feel like for you to grow any business, let's face it, you need to be consistent. And I think a lot of people can like the idea of doing something or achieving something or the idea of having a certain type of business. But at the end of the day, whether I look at a consulting business or a product-based business or a podcast, the reality is the secret to your success is hidden in your daily routine. It's the things that you're doing on the daily, on the weekly. And a podcast is no different because you need that consistency.
Definitely.
And obviously, building the brand initially, you would have had a lot of episodes going out regularly, which would have required a lot of discipline to make all of that happen. Do you feel like the consistency with podcasts, especially in the early stages, has been a big part of growing the brand?
I think definitely in the early stages, and we were very consistent at the start. It was always an episode every week, dropping on the same day at the same time. And so that really allowed people to know when to come back. And we would have I would have actual season breaks and really notify people of hey, we're having a season break here, but we'll be back on this day. I think also getting people to subscribe to the podcast in those early stages so they're being notified, really driving that. Sometimes people are like, oh, why are you driving subscribers so much? But it's Apple or Spotify, whatever they're subscribing on, is actually notifying them when an episode goes live. So that's a really valuable tool as a podcaster to encourage people to subscribe. But I definitely lacked, after I had my first daughter, I got back into it pretty quick. I only think I had about a 6-week break, but that's when the podcast was at its absolute peak. I'd just done a East Coast podcast live tour with Georgie Stevenson. So the Rise and Conquer podcast and the Healthy Hustlers. We did 3 shows. I was 37 weeks pregnant. So crazy to think back. With my first, when we did our Melbourne event, it was so crazy. I look at the photos now, I'm like, oh my goodness, girl, I look like I was about to literally give birth. I was only about 3 weeks off it. And so that point, it was absolutely booming. They were just every episode was just thousands and thousands and thousands of downloads. And I was like, wow, this is just nuts. And there was so many opportunities for partnerships. I was starting to get Instagram partnerships, but then I got thrust straight into, being a mum for the first time, which I'd always wanted. But all of a sudden it was this demand, this career that I'd started to build and just loved, with also being a first-time mom and learning how to breastfeed and, have this baby with me 24/7. And it was a really bit of a crazy time, but she was a great firstborn. She was a great sleeper, great feeder, all of that. So I was able to kind of juggle that, I guess, or navigate that a lot. Now, in hindsight, a lot easier than my second. So I was back recording, I think, at 10 weeks. So it stayed pretty consistent basically until COVID hit when Georgia was 7 months and we were in Melbourne, Victoria. So we were in intense lockdown. And that's where prior to that, I had, flown around the countryside interviewing everyone in person. I had portable kit. And so the quality of the podcast was amazing because it was all in person. It was quite a high end podcast, I guess. And then we got smashed to moved to online, which at the time was almost like so great for me because I had a 7-month-old baby at home with me and I could not leave like 5 kilometers from my house, let alone travel interstate. So, and every podcast moved online. Like it was just the whole industry had to go online. There was no other opportunity. So at the start that really helped because people were so keen to be sharing and doing something and finding new avenues because the whole world was in lockdown kind of thing. So I found that first few months of COVID like really easy to be creating content and staying consistent. But then after that, when everyone else started coming out of lockdown and Victoria was still totally locked down, like I remember having calls with you like nearly in tears. I'm just like, Liv, I just need to get out of this lockdown. I just felt so restricted. And I think that's when my mindset really started to slip. And that was just such a flow-on effect of, the quality of content that I was creating and, my inspiration and creativity for doing the show. And so I felt like there was probably an 18-month period where there was a real inconsistency. And that is absolutely when I noticed, I just learned the hard way that you absolutely have to be consistent with something. And in that space of time, not only was I inconsistent, but the podcast industry in itself just absolutely boomed. It was like every man and his dog was launching a podcast show. The quality of podcasts were amazing because they were all done by big networks. There was video content. And that was just like affecting my mindset even more. I remember just thinking like, I cannot compete with this. Like I've always been an independent, self-managed podcast show. I don't have the time or the resources to compete at this level. But something that kept coming back was like when I was producing content and putting it up, I'd get influxes of messages. It's so good to have you back and I've missed you. And, the podcast would be back in the charts and episodes were doing so well. And I'm like, I'm not even like promoting this. Like I'm just literally uploading an episode that I recorded from my laundry in my kid's nap. And I think it just kept sitting there. And I think once I had more clarity after my second born and kind of got out those postpartum blues and I was able to really sit with it, I just knew that what I was doing it's exactly what I wanted to do. If I was to give it up in that moment, I'd only be trying to recreate it in another year or two down the track because it is literally lights my soul on fire. So I actually made the decision to sign with a network. So I'm no longer an independent podcast. I'm with, DM Podcast, which is they're an independent network. They're not associated with any of the big, I guess, radio networks. So they're an independent network based in Sydney and they incredible. Like it's just been a complete change in my ability to want to show up and my like creativity and my desire to create episodes and to interview people. So I signed with them. I think it was maybe in July or August, and we launched in September. So at the moment, I feel like it's just exactly where I want it to be. It's consistent. There's 2 episodes a week. The quality's amazing. We've got video content. It's just like, feels like my podcast dreams have all all come to life.
Amazing. Well, congratulations. I think that's such an incredible achievement. And I feel like in a way, it's almost like you as the visionary, because I know that you're an ideas generator. You've got ideas until the cows come home, like every visionary does. It's almost like this network has been your integrator so that you've been able to focus on doing what you love and then they take care of the back end, which is amazing. And obviously what I preach to clients all the time about the work that I do as well in consulting and setting up the business in a way where you as the visionary CEO can focus on creating content or creating products or services or doing what it is that energizes you and lights you up, but then having that integrator in the business to support you so that you're able to do the things that are energizing and not the things that are draining.
Absolutely. And that's been such a big lesson for me is like, I think that was always my vision, was to have like this team that supported me so that I could just be that visionary and be creating and content. But, that also like, there's just things that came into play or things that weren't flowing, that weren't allowing that almost in my life, if that made sense. And I think I was also trying to do too much and look in too many other people's lanes. And it was like,
Yes.
oh, they're doing that. Oh, maybe I should try that. Or, they're having success with that. Oh, I need to be doing that as well to keep up. But it's like once I've actually sat with it and got really clear on, well, what am I here for? Like, I'm creating a podcast, which I'm very fortunate makes me good money. And my sole purpose right now with all of my content is to drive people to listen to my podcast. It's not to do, to get lots of Instagram reel views or to, tell people how to be a good mum, like a empowering mum or anything like that. It's my purpose is actually to drive people to my podcast because that is where all the value that I have is. And so I think once I got clear on that, and then I've been able to start to kind of make a framework. So I feel like I'm almost going back to basic, like back to the start all over again. Now that I know that I'm back to a point where the quality of the podcast is so high, it's like I can actually take that step to build around that rather than kind of like dipping my toe in here and dipping my toe in there and then nothing being quite good enough or, quite, yeah.
Yeah.
So there's this balance between done is better than perfect. It's like done is better than perfect is great at the start, but then once you actually have people who have like, bought in and like actually really, I guess you've built that bit of social proof. It's like they want high quality and they are either exchanging money or time for what you're delivering. So yeah, they've all just been little lessons along the journey as there is.
Little lessons, always lessons. But yeah, I think there's a lot of truth to that in regards to the evolution of the brand as well. And what you were saying before about the importance of staying in your lane. I see this a lot where I have conversations with business owners or CEOs, visionaries, and, they're comparing their business to another business or their brand to another brand. And it's like, well, yeah, that's great, but they're at a totally different chapter of their journey, potentially in a different industry with a different vision. We all have different goals individually as well about what we actually want from our businesses and the things that we're doing. So I think there's a lot of power in staying in your lane, and particularly when it comes to competition per se or competitors and what everyone else is doing, for you to be laser sharp on your vision and what you're trying to achieve and not be distracted by other things that are going on around you is the best space to be, because you can then protect your energy and channel your energy into achieving your vision instead of worrying about what else is going on around you. Because I think at the end of the day, and you sort of touched on this before, you are unique. No one can replicate being you, and the energy that you bring, in the context of the podcast, the energy that you bring to the podcast, the way that you build relationships with people is not going to be the same as another podcast or somebody else, because you're unique. And that is the power of having a personal brand.
Yes. And it's really interesting that you touch on that personal brand, because I think that's almost something that I had almost built that so well for the podcast, but I hadn't done it well for myself. And so here I was being this host or, putting out to the world, I'm the host of The Healthy Hustlers, which is a health and mindset podcast. But here I am on my Instagram sharing the struggles, the absolute trenches of motherhood, which at that time was so relevant, but it probably had such a negative impact really on my business because I wasn't showing up. I wasn't embodying that person that I was saying I was being. And, they're all seasons of life. And I very much believe in being kind and, meeting yourself where you're at. I wasn't even letting myself have a positive mindset. All I was sharing myself in my pajamas still at 12 o'clock. And I'm like, that's not inspiring for anyone. No one wants to then be like, oh, hey, she has this really inspirational podcast. I'm going to jump on and listen to it. It's like they're probably listening to it being like, oh, this girl needs to practice what she preaches because she's still in her pajamas at 11 o'clock with her baby hanging off her. And so this year I've been working a lot more on that personal brand of well, what is it? And the freedom that's actually come with that of what I do share and what I don't share has been so nice. And I think as a creative person, it's allowed so much more space in my life to focus on the things that I want to build rather than focusing on what I'm constantly sharing online. Because I'm like, well, no, that doesn't fit the kids might be sick this week. And, I haven't, last night I got 4 hours sleep or, because my son was up all night. And once upon a time I would have got up and that would have been the first thing I would have shared of my morning. But it's no, I don't sit in that energy anymore and I don't let that dictate who I am. And so it's it's been really interesting understanding the power in that personal brand and what it is that I do share now and what I don't share. And it's not about being inauthentic or anything. It's just about, it's a brand at the end of the day, you know, and I need people to feel inspired by me and learn from my mindset and my practices rather than, you know, me sitting in the lack mindset, which I was last year.
For sure. And I think it's about alignment as well, you know, being really aligned with what your business is and what you're doing on that side and bringing that through your personal brand and your social media as well. And I know that we touched on this briefly offline as well in our pre-chat of saying it's not everyone's cup of tea to do the daily vlog style on socials. You know, some people are really good at it and they get a lot of enjoyment from it and they've built brands around it. And I think that's amazing. But for other people, that's not their cup of tea and it's not their zone of genius and that's not what energizes them. So you have to do what works for you and what feels comfortable and in alignment for you as well in order to feel like you're showing up authentically. Because I feel like sometimes, you know, it's easy to look at other people's content and think, oh, that's what I should be doing. But that might not necessarily be a fit for you.
Definitely. And exactly what you said about like some people do it so well and it is their zone of genius and it comes across in that, it's received in that energy, like whether when it's not like it never came naturally to me to share lots of detail about my life on Instagram because I always felt like Instagram has never, it's an amazing, you know, business builder and I'm very grateful for the connections and how it's helped me build my business, but it's never been a space that I've felt overly safe in because I think, you know, anyone can come in and leave comments or make comments or see my children and see my house or all of that sort of stuff. It just never felt overly safe. Whether the podcast, I always feel like I've sat in my power because of that value exchange that I've spoken about. You know, people are actually coming on, they're eager to learn, they're curious, they're open-minded already, but they just want to go a little bit deeper. And so they come into the podcast with that intention and they're giving me their time in return for, you know, value in terms of health and mindset and connecting with people that they already love and admire. And so it's always felt like such a safe space for me. And I think that that's where the difference has been in the growth of like, I've been able to grow quite quickly and naturally on the podcast, where the Instagram's just never been a space where I've like grown or, you know, put a lot of energy into.
I think it's more disposable too. Like watching someone's Instagram stories, they're up for 24 hours, they're gone. Like you're having these, you know, at times surface level conversations. But I feel like for someone to take the next step, actually go and listen to you on a podcast, there's a different level of investment from their part to come into your world. And so you're right, it is a different energy, which I think is really powerful. Now, I know that we also share our love of all things spiritual. It's possibly something that people don't outwardly know about me potentially as well, because obviously my personal brand is very business and strategy and logical and, you know, that side, but I don't often talk about my spirituality and my beliefs around that. And I know that we have very shared views on all things spiritual. So I'd love for you to speak to your journey with spirituality. I know you love human design. We've spoken about this at lengths in many of our chats. Angel numbers, the power of a positive mindset, which you've already spoken about on the episode today. Can you delve into this side of you a little bit deeper and tell us more about that?
Absolutely. Yeah, I love this. And I know how much we totally connected on that. I still vividly remember when you sold your home and you called me and you're like, I've got to tell you this story about my manifestation of the house. Like, I know you're someone that will really understand. And we were on the phone for like an hour and a half before we even got into like our coaching call. And it was so, I remember that moment just being like, oh my God, she's so my type of person. I love this girl. We hadn't even met in person yet. But yeah, look, I think to be completely honest, it's always been there for me. When I speak about or I refer to spirituality, it's always been there for me. My mum lost both of her parents before my brother and I were born. And so I think she probably really instilled a spiritual belief in us without probably even realizing it or being overly aware. But it was just simple things. When we were kids, she would always say, look for the brightest star in the sky. And we'd both pick one. And then she'd say, that's Nana Lee and that's Papa Russ. And so I really went like, you know, growing up, I had this philosophy of I always had someone with this higher power, this higher energy supporting me. And I really grew up truly believing that like my nan and pop, who I'd never even met, I'd only seen photos of, were supporting me, that they were stars in the sky. And we had this huge window in our family home when you went up the staircase. And you just see the night's stars. And so every night I would go to bed, and it's still, when I go to my parents' house now, I will just look up in that window and be like, what's the brightest star? So I really feel like it began there for me, was having that belief someone was supporting me. And then I grew up, my nan was very Catholic, and not that I would call myself Catholic, but we did go to Catholic schools. My nan was very religious. So there was definitely always that, I guess, conversation or beliefs throughout our family of, you know, spirituality or religion, that there was something wiser and more powerful supporting us. So that's kind of where it evolved. But I think it really got deep for me when I had my first daughter. There was definitely a lot of it that I probably suppressed or always felt but never spoke about, because, you know, I didn't really have the people to talk about it to. And it does sound a bit woo-woo and strange to some people. So for me, it was when I had my daughter, that was such a spiritual experience and such a spiritual awakening. Like from the moment that I conceived her, I just knew, it was like I had seen her in my mind's eye for my whole life. And it was like I knew what she was going to look like and almost feel like and touch. It was so crazy. And like every movement in her, I was so connected to her, and I spoke to her my whole pregnancy. And when she was born, she came out and like wasn't crying. She was just like, I'd had like a 52-hour labor as well. It was the most intense couple of days. And like I did that final push, and they're like, the baby's here. And she just looked at me. She wasn't crying or anything. She just had these beaming blue eyes. And she just stared at me like she was exactly where she needed to be, and like she knew me. And I just will never forget the moment of like them putting her on my chest. And I just like, it just literally felt like I was home. It was like everything that I had always believed and seen in my mind's eye had came true. And that was a moment that I was always meant to live. And I think that just like completely cemented my belief in spirituality and energy. And so from that, I kind of really shifted from a bit more of a health focus on the podcast to becoming really passionate about spirituality and mindset. And to me, spirituality and mindset are literally the same thing. Like I feel like spiritual practices are just a mindset, you know, habit really. And so I'm really big into angel numbers and spiritual signs and spiritual meanings. And I feel like they've had a really huge impact on my business, more from a perspective of just allowing you to fully trust that there always is a meaning behind something. There's always a reason why something is happening. It's always a greater force supporting you. And I feel like the more that you lean into that, the more that you can actually live from a very positive, you know, safe almost mindset, rather than always living in that fear state or that what if. It's like, okay, I'm trusting this. And then on the flip side, my son was like the completely different experience, where he almost was the one teaching me that all the beliefs that I had were actually true, because I totally wasn't ready for him, and he was a bit of a surprise. And then I found out I was having a boy, and I had massive gender disappointment, which sounds crazy, but just at the time I was so not ready for like a second child. And then to think I was having a boy, and I'd seen all my friends with boys and how busy they were, I was like, how am I possibly going to do this like with a business and a toddler? And so, but he's just absolutely taught me to just trust the process, and that the universe actually always has a plan so much greater than the one you had. And he's just been the most beautiful addition to our family. And, you know, he's had lots of health challenges, and he's a terrible sleeper, but it's really taught me about the art of surrender, and to just trust that, you know, you are where you need to be, and that there is lessons in all of the hardships that you do face. So yeah, for me, I think that's where spirituality is kind of entwined in my life. And I would say that I'm a deeply spiritual person. I really believe that, you know, I have angels supporting me. When my nan passed away 18 months ago, she was like my best friend. I used to have my office at the back of her house, which had a tree out the front of it where my pop's ashes were. So it was like a really spiritual experience for me every time I was in my office, I'd have these 3 white butterflies that would float around that I swore were my 3 grandparents. And then my nan was obviously in her house. And I feel like I created some of my best work from working from that space. And ever since she passed away, I just started seeing 444 everywhere, which I knew was spiritual protection. But for me, it was just like, wow, Nan is like fully with me. And I've got a necklace of it that I wear now every day. And I've had some of the wildest experiences with seeing 444. And yeah, I think for me, it just brings so much comfort. It just brings so much comfort to my life to feel like there is something or someone or an energy far greater than me always supporting me and working in my favor, especially in, harder times.
For sure. I feel like the universe always has a plan. And sometimes in life, in business, in situations where things don't go to plan, you realize later on, oh, wow, actually, I was really helped by the universe in that moment, because if that hadn't happened, I would have been in a totally different space, or equally, this opportunity that I've got now potentially wouldn't have arisen. So I think that there's definitely a lot of power in surrendering and feeling as though the universe does truly have your back. I'd love to know, what things do you do generally in your week in regards to spirituality for your practices that you really love and enjoy and bring a lot of value in your life?
Yes, that's a really good question. Well, I feel like angel numbers are something that I really believe in. They're probably, especially now, I feel like I've shifted a lot since becoming a mum as well, and having a business, Liv, like you're so time poor. And I hate saying like we're time poor because everyone has the same hours in the day, but it's true. Like, I had to kind of change up my practices and make them kind of fit into my life a lot easier than actually dedicating the time to like sit down and meditate or that. But angel numbers are a big one. So I have my own, one of the best advice I got about angel numbers was it can mean whatever you want it to mean. So there's obviously been meanings or things that have been placed around angel numbers. And when I'm referring to angel numbers, it's seeing a number consecutively. So 111 or 222.
911 as well. I feel like a lot of people see 911 and like as you said, 444.
And a lot of people see that. I feel like there's a meaning behind it too. And I do remember a stage where I was seeing that a lot, but I can't actually remember what it's meant to mean. But it's anything like that just kind of shows up. And I think the first step is like just bringing awareness to that. And in that moment, I always like to think like, what am I thinking about right now? Like bringing awareness to the fact I'm seeing this number. So 222 was one I used to see a lot. And a lot when you and I were connecting, I remember seeing 222 all the time when we were working together, and I was always like, oh my goodness, I see this all the time. And it was at a stage every time that I would see it, it was when I was almost having this moment of doubt, or I was questioning myself, or I was looking too far in someone else's lane. And the meaning of 222 is actually that you're exactly where you're meant to be. You're on the right path. And so it was just like that gentle reminder of the universe to like, just keep going. Like you're on the right path. You're exactly where you're meant to be. And so the more I would start to see a certain number, I see 555 all the time the last kind of 12 months, 18 months since I had my son. 555 is meant to represent positive change. And so for me, it's just like that reminder from the universe of like, I know it's hard right now, but it's on the way to a positive change, and you're going to look back and you're going to be so grateful for this. And like, now I'm at a point where he's 17 months, like my marriage is better than it's ever been. We're on the same page of like our dreams and where we want to live and the life we want to work towards. So yeah, I just love using them on a daily basis of having that meaning and significance, because it's just like, I can take a breath in that moment and just go, thank you, universe. Thank you so much. I'm also such a big one of like communication. And I talk about this a lot on my podcast. I do a lot of spiritual episodes on the podcast, solo ones. I say about like communicating with the universe. And I know that's going to sound so woo-woo to some people, but it's like in your head or out loud, whatever feels good to you. I do have that daily communication, and it might be something as simple as, a brand I wanted to work with have agreed to come sponsor the podcast. And I will just take that moment and say, thank you so much, universe. I really I'm so happy that's come to life. Or an opportunity comes my way, or I don't know, I get a car park, or I take both the kids out and it's just such an easy breezy morning, and I'll like get home and I'll say, thank you, universe. I really needed that easy morning. Like it's just having those moments of gratitude when something feels good. And I feel like the more that you're leaning into that and you're showing that moment of gratitude and you're sitting that feeling for a little bit longer, it just amplifies like that energy, like you become a vibrational match for more of that. And so the more you sit in a mindset of lack or, I'm not doing enough or I'm not good enough or this is happening to me or, it's not fair or of course this happened to me. Of course I can't find a car park or of course I got a speeding fine. This always happens to me. Like the more you're sitting in that energy, that's a vibration you're actually sending out. And that's what you're going to keep attracting more and more and more of that. Whether the moment that you are sitting in that, that positive, abundant mindset and you're having those moments of gratitude and you're, taking moments to be truly thankful, like you're just going to keep radiating that frequency more and more. And the universe will just keep delivering the goodness. I actually got a speeding fine, not that I want to admit it, but I got a speeding fine when I came home from my last podcast recording. I was in Sydney. I'd flown up at I got up at 4 a.m. in the morning, flew to Sydney at 6 a.m. in the morning, full day of recording in studio. My flight then got delayed home. And it was the best day. It was just so smooth sailing. My flight then got delayed home. I didn't end up getting home until 2 a.m. in the morning. And the last 5 minutes of my drive home at 2 a.m. in the morning, I got a speeding fine. And so, that arrived on my doorstep. And I remember having this moment where it was like, my energy was like, just wanted to scream and be like, why has this happened? And I just thought to myself, no, Maddie, like that day was so magical. Like it actually just was, I was in the best energy all day. We created such epic content. I was supported by this team. My flight was delayed in the evening, not in the morning. So instead, I just really switched my mindset and focused on all the goodness that came that day and thought, you know what, if the worst that's happened is that I've got a 1-point speeding fine, like that's probably just a lesson that maybe I should have stayed in Melbourne that night and not driven home or, had a little rest before I actually got into the car to drive. Like, what's the lesson in this? Like, what am I trying to learn? So just flipping into that mindset more. And I communicate that with the universe. I'm like, okay, universe, I understand. Maybe that wasn't the best decision and my lesson is learned. So yeah, I think the more that you can kind of stay in those energies, the more the universe is going to continue to serve up the goodness.
For sure. I love that so much, especially the power of gratitude. And as you said, calling in more of that frequency and more of those opportunities, because I think sometimes, particularly in our busy lives, having businesses, children even, it's very easy to gloss over our achievements or gloss over all of the good in our lives and beyond the never-ending quest for the next thing or the next goal. But there's so much power in actually just smelling the roses and just taking a minute to really lap up everything that you've been able to achieve. And even when you have those good days, as you said. And in terms of what you were saying just then as well about the lesson that you found in that, I think that's so powerful as well. And that is the ethos of cause and effect, which I talk about quite often, and being on the cause side of the equation instead of being on the effect side of the equation, and constantly asking yourself, how can I be at cause for this situation? And what is the learning opportunity that I can bring forward, which is exactly what you did in that moment. And I think that is, if there's one thing that you can learn in life to fully understand the concept of cause and effect, is so empowering. And that has the potential to totally transform your life. So I love that you had those thought processes in that moment, despite, the negative situation of having a speeding fine.
Definitely. I think too, when you do really start to lean into this, I guess, work or philosophy, whatever you want to refer to it as, you start to become so aware of how good it feels to sit in a high vibration. So when you're outside of that, you're very aware of how crappy that feels. Do you know what I mean? I know the moment that my energy shifts and I'm sitting in that lack mindset, because it's a work in progress. It's not like I just constantly sit in an abundant positive mindset. It's a daily choice really to choose that energy. But I know how crappy it feels to sit in the lack mindset. And I know what comes with that and I remind myself hey, I don't want to go back there. I don't want to have those experiences. I don't want to wake up feeling like this. I love waking up feeling, ready and inspired and motivated. And even if my kids are screaming and blah, 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 I just think I have the power to change all of this around us. Can I put on frequency music? Can I have a dance party with them? How do I connect with them and be the person that dictates the energy rather than being the one that just lets the energy around them kind of soak up the way they feel?
Definitely. Yeah. I just think you are such an incredible person, like in all of the ways. You're this magical angel energy person on a human level, but then you are such a visionary and you've got all these amazing ideas and this incredible ability to connect with people. And then you've got this amazing spiritual side to you as well. I just think you're so multifaceted and I've just always loved that about you.
Oh, thanks, Liv. That's so nice.
My pleasure. And it's been so nice to have you on the show and just find out, get stuck into the nitty gritty of your corporate career and then the podcast and you as a mum and then this other side of you as a spiritual being. I just think there's so much to you and I've just loved having you on the show today to share everything about your world and who you are. And I'm curious, I would love to know, just to finish up the episode, I'd love to know what your mantra is, or if there's one piece of advice that you could give listeners that are listening to this episode now, what would you want to share with them? Like, what's the one golden nugget that you can give them that has transformed your life or it has helped you in some way that you think you could pass on to them?
Well, firstly, I just want to say thank you so much for having me because I am so inspired by you. You're just an incredible businesswoman and mum, and, you know, you've been a good friend and a mentor to me for a long time. And I feel really honoured that you asked me to be on the show, to be honest. So thank you for that and all your beautiful words. Oh, this is such a hard one. It's so funny because I always ask the guests for, like, you know, the best piece of advice or the one thing that shifted. And it's funny because then when I get asked it, I'm like, oh, I don't know. Like, I don't know. But I think that if I could give away anything, it's like, never underestimate, one, the power of your energy. I really believe that your energy is your currency. And the more that you can harness that, the greater your life will be and the greater the things that you desire will come to you and the faster they'll come to you. And the other thing is just to, you know, your intuition is your greatest asset. Like, it honestly holds the key to everything. It will unlock your wildest dreams and your desires if you allow it. And I think that to really tap into that, it's, you know, getting curious about your own thoughts and starting to journal and meditation and bringing a lot of awareness to that inner dialogue that you have. And that requires space and it requires time, and it's not going to be an overnight, you know, fix. But if you can start prioritizing those moments of stillness and, you know, experimenting with meditation and journaling your thoughts, the more that you can get in touch with your own intuition and inner knowing, you just unlock so much of your own potential. And I think that that's where a lot of the magic actually really sits, but we just don't take the time to really slow down and to listen to that. And it can start, you know, if you are totally new to intuition and trusting that, like, we all have it, we all hold it. And you can start as simple as, like, listening to that niggle. Like, if you're in a bit of a yucky conversation with friends and it just doesn't feel right, like, listen to that intuition and step away from that. If it's, you know, if you're on a date with someone or, you know, I don't know, a business opportunity comes your way and it's just not a hell yes, or it doesn't feel right, like, trust your intuition, listen to it. Because the more that you start to listen, the louder it will become. So I think they're probably the two things that, I really believe can just unlock so much in us if we allow the time and space.
I love that. That's so powerful. Thank you for sharing. And for listeners, just before we finish up, how do they get in touch with you? How do they listen to the podcast? Where should they go if they want more of Mads in their life?
Well, I would love you to head over to the Healthy Hustlers podcast, which is available on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, and anywhere you listen to podcasts, it should be there, the Healthy Hustlers. So that's my main, I guess, content. And then I do hang out on Instagram just at my name, Madelyn Carafa. I share my mindset and spirituality there, as well as a little sprinkle of motherhood. And hopefully there'll be a lot more in the pipelines next year. I have been doing a lot with events, so hoping to bring them back to life early next year, as well as a few other little projects in the works. So, yeah.
Amazing. Thank you for sharing. Again, thank you so much for your time today and for sharing all of your wisdom and your story with listeners on the show today. Again, I'm super excited to have you here, and I think we'll have to do an encore next year so that we can find out more about the events when that happens.
Absolutely. I would love that. No, thank you so much for having me. I'm honestly, like, I was, so humbled and honored to be asked to be a guest, because I just admire everything you do and, you know, the people you work with and what you achieve in your business. It's incredible.
Thank you so much. And I'm excited to have you on next year.
Thank you so much for tuning into today's episode. If you loved today's show, be sure to let me know by leaving a 5-star review. You can also connect with me via Instagram at oliviajenkins.co or learn more on how we can work together at www.oliviajenkins.co. Have an amazing week, and I can't wait to connect with you in the next episode.